Welcome to Sunday morning of a cybersecurity conference. Glad to see so many bright-eyed, bushy-tailed fellow humans. A few more piling in. Close enough for government work. This is ham radio and you. The original intention was to do a couple-minute presentation using, like 1950s and 40s informational, the scratchy videos, but that didn't work out. So you got me instead. My name is Brandon Curnutte, amateur radio call sign KE8KNX. That's not anything clever. It's randomly assigned by the FCC. The person before me got KE8KNY, and then if you're put your mind to it, you can figure out who got the call sign after me. What is ham radio? First off, the term ham is a pejorative term used in professional wired telegraphy since the 19th century to mock operators with poor Morse code sending skills, saying they're ham-fisted. Wired telegraphy, telegraphs predates wireless, and there weren't too many amateur wired Morse code operators, so once the wireless scene kind of took off, then the pros didn't like the newbies, as often goes with anything tech. The official definition of amateur radio is the use of radio frequency spectrum for purposes of non-commercial exchange of messages, wireless experimentation, self-training, private recreation, radio sport contesting, and emergency communication. We'll dig into some more of those. First off, what is non-commercial? Amateur radio is not terrestrial radio and television. So whatever you pick up in your car or on your TV. If anybody still has an antenna for their TV, anybody? Show of hands. There's a few. Look at that. The HD is uncompressed and looks a lot better. You can really see a difference. Satellite services of about any kind. There are some satellite repeaters for amateur radio, which are pretty nifty to play around with. Business two-way communication, like cabs, tow trucks, those all have separate licenses from the FCC. And your cell phones, they are ultra-high frequency transceivers, but on a separate FCC license as well. Wireless experimentation. This is a map of an application called Whisper. It's a global network of amateur radio operators connecting their radios to their computers and operating at low power. If you can see, this is a map of a station in Europe. And I don't know which frequency they're listening on, but basically all these stations have operated within a 2-minute window, and they've taken turns broadcasting and then listening. And this station in Europe can hear all these stations from all around the world on low-power digital transmission. So it's interesting to watch where your transmissions go and where you can pick up other stations' transmissions, and it tells you where the bands may be open or where there's good propagation on if you wanted to make some long-distance contacts. Computer modeling. This is is the starting screen for an antenna modeling software. This has made things a lot easier before the days of just soldering things together and using math and hoping to get something out in the air. You can design new antennas, test out an antenna in your own backyard or wherever you plan on setting up. So you can get a decent idea of how well your antenna is going to perform before you actually put it together. This program was used to build on one of the more popular multiband antennas that was originally designed for one specific frequency, but it was discovered that it works decently well on others, and this software was used to improve on that one and make a true multiband antenna. And then there's a few articles out there where people have used this software to improve on it even further. So people are always tinkering. Most everything's open source. This is a free software. There are paid softwares, as with about anything else. Oh, that was the software was called FL Digi. It's available for about any operating system. Windows, Linux, Mac. If you got something weird, then I probably can't help you with that. People are still using Morse code. 5 points to whoever can decipher that. Nothing? That was secure WV in Morse code. That was done using the antenna software was called 4NEC. This is FL-Digi. This is a digital mode interaction with your computer. This is just a screenshot of something random I found online, but I did build that. You can create Morse code on the software and then broadcast it that way if you don't want to learn how to tap it out yourself. You can also listen as well. You can tune to a frequency, plug your radio into your computer, and it will spell out Morse code right like that. I've heard watched some pretty interesting conversations from all over the world just spell out just on receive mode. And radio teletype is also still around, if anybody remembers the old newsreels with the tickers in the back. There are some hardcore amateur radio operators that still use that old hardware, but it's all done on computers now. Radio teletype or RIDI is still fairly popular. Self-training. If you want to get into amateur radio, there are it's called cram sessions. That's where a club or an organization, somebody will read through every question in the FCC test bank several times and then take the test immediately after, since the questions are all public. They'll do that at a club function. But it's mostly kind of a loner activity unless you really try hard to be around other people. You can get training or tests at what's called a hamfest. It's kind of like a convention for amateur radio. They do a lot of buying and selling, a few classes, and a lot of testing there. You can tune in on some of the frequent, what's called nets. Those are just meetings on the air. There's several that go on locally, and some of the lower frequencies, they were regionally or even worldwide. You can get a lot of tips and information from those once you're able to transmit. But I mean, anybody can listen if you have the equipment. Club gatherings. I know the local club, they took over one of the picnic areas at Coonskin over the summer, and they were just having an open radio day. They had antennas all over the trees. They were making contacts all over the world, and anybody could come. And Jamboree on the Air, it's a weekend where the entire world kind of gets together and tries to make contacts. It's not really a contest, but it's just a way to, I guess, kind of introduce more people to amateur radio. The Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts get involved with that quite a bit, especially in this area. I know my Cub Scout group has gone to the Jamboree on the Air. Private recreation. This is not my station. I don't know who that is in those photos over there, but another random picture plucked from the internet. But this is a basic, fairly advanced ham shack or amateur radio station. I see a microphone, computer screens, amplifiers, transceivers, all kinds of stuff. Yours can be as complicated as this or as basic as just a radio in a corner of the room. It's really up to you. But it gives you opportunity to experiment with different technologies or even invent new ones. That happens all the time. People are using the Raspberry Pi has been very, very beneficial to the amateur radio community. Somebody figured out that they can transmit in the very high frequency range on one of the pins, so they're turning that into a self-contained amateur radio transceiver just off a Raspberry Pi. Now, without filters and amplifiers, it won't get much further than this room, but that's just one of the things that Ham's discovered. And another thing is making global contacts with basic equipment. The propagation, which is your radio frequency bouncing around within the atmosphere. Using basic equipment like that, you can really reach over the horizon into different countries, different regions, even different continents. I've seen it on YouTube. Haven't really done it myself yet, but I've only been in this a couple of years. Even some of the guys that have done it for 30 years are still experimenting and trying new things. Radio sport is kind of the physical activities associated with amateur radio. Radio direction finding, or I've heard it called fox hunting. They'll hide a transmitter somewhere out in the woods, urban environment, and you'll use your radio skills and equipment to kind of find it. Summit on the Air, that is a competition where you try to make contacts from certain mountain or hilltop peaks within a region. You'll climb to X mountain here, make a contact, climb to the next mountain. Gets more active, so not all the amateur radio operators look like me. D-expeditions, these are really interesting. This is what this is a picture of. It's a tropical location. They set up fiberglass antennas with wires all over the place, and they make contacts from there. If anybody is interested in travel to unique locations, I know as far as amateur radio is concerned, the world is kind of spread out in regions, grids, unique islands, unique places to make contacts from or to. So if somebody travels to whatever remote island this is, and I'm guessing South Pacific probably, then you may or may not have that checked off on your list or pinned on your map or have a postcard from there. So it's one of the goals that people try to put together these distance expeditions to kind of make those contacts, or have fun for themselves and to provide pins on the map for other people. DX, this stands for distance exchange, on all manner of frequencies, transmission modes, power levels, locations. There's almost always a contest going on at some point using high frequency, very high frequencies in digital modes, voice, Morse code only, or CW, continuous wave, you'll hear it called that. Low power, no power limits at all. Some of the higher powered stations in a region with amplifiers and really expensive antennas can kind of knock out any other signals, but there's something you got to deal with. Then in different locations, like I mentioned, the D-expeditions to there's a big desire to have contacts from the Vatican and some strange island in the Mediterranean off of Sicily. There's an amateur radio station there, but they only let so many people in per year to use it. So if somebody goes there, they're putting all over message boards and whatnot, so people can be listening and tuning their antennas, waiting to get a contact or a QSO postcard from that location. And emergency communication is one of the biggest reasons somebody might get involved in amateur radio, either just to participate themselves or in some of the organizations. The Amateur Radio Emergency Service, or ARES, is a worldwide ham radio emergency communication organization that's put together by amateur radio operators. It's all volunteer-based. I'm not aware of any, professional paid positions within that. It's all, like I said, volunteer-based. They'll meet up about any time of the month. They have regular nets. They have drills, practice to communicate from different locations and different situations. Radio Amateur Civil Emergency Service, or RACES, is organized and managed by FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. That is just an interface between the amateur radio operators and the federal government. Very similar. On the amateur radio side, it's all volunteer-based. They have regular meetings, nets, or groups on the air, drills, activities, that kind of thing. One that I'm not very familiar with is the Military Auxiliary Radio System, or MARS. It's interface between the U.S. military and amateur radio, which is different, from the federal government, though similar. Recently, the Navy dropped this program. They just didn't feel it was necessary, but the Army and the Air Force still have MARS setups. Something I've been reading into lately. I guess I'm working my way down the list. Some of the practical examples of emergency communication. In the September 11th, 2001 attacks, the main repeater for most of the first responders, fire, police, EMS, was on the North Tower. So when that went down, communication went down. One of my coworkers was living in New York at the time, and he was telling me about amateur radio operators going around with police officers, fire trucks, and different, amateur repeater stations set up in locations where it was needed to keep communication up and running in such a disaster. Other examples are up there: Hurricane Katrina, earthquake in China, and the Boston Marathon bombing in Boston. The communications, they were just unprepared for such a, with everything else going on with the marathon itself. The communications were overwhelmed, and amateurs stepped in to kind of help out as they could. It's kind of a visual example of what amateur radio is. If you can see, this is a dipole antenna, or two poles, positive, negative. You can see this is the radio frequency interacting with the wire of this simple antenna, changing the polarity up and down, left and right. I'm not an electrical engineer. Somebody else smarter than me can explain that much better than I could. But this kind of explains how the radio waves emanating from one antenna will interact with another one. Here's a view of the same antenna, but from the top transmitting. It radiates out from your antenna and kind of is like a donut pattern out. This is just a top view and a slice of that. So antenna modeling and placement could be its own course for days and days and days. It's something that's still being experimented with, even though wireless has been around for over 100 years. But one of the things you want to look for is the critical angle, to where if you're interested in long distance contacts, you'll want your radio waves to go out towards the horizon. So if it smacks right into a mountain, then you probably want to reposition your antenna. But if you're curious what radio frequencies are, what ham radio actually physically does in our world, this is an example of how this electromagnetic energy interacts with an antenna and how it's transmitted from an antenna. It's something I found useful. Now, within amateur radio, within the radio spectrum, these are the frequencies allocated to amateur radio. If you hear somebody say the 2-meter band, 20-meter band, it's these portions here of the radio spectrum that's been allocated to amateur radio. So if somebody says 2 meters, that's in a very high frequency. It's this section here to this section there. And these all don't butt together directly. There's other services. Almost all the radio frequency spectrum is taken up by something. There's very little from the lower end to the higher end of useful radio frequency that's not set aside for somebody. But this is what amateur radio has. This column here is mostly relegated to very high frequency, 6 meters and 10 meters. They are actually, what I can do, when we say 6, 10, 2 meters, that is the distance between these two dotted lines here. That is the wavelength. That is the alternating current changing from positive to a negative current in the air. That's a lot easier than saying, the 21 megahertz, the 24 megahertz section of the frequency. You just say 15, 10 meter band. One of the things you learn as your education goes along. This is just a visual representation of what the FCC, the licensing agency in the United States, has allocated to amateur radio operators in the United States. Now, as I was saying, they don't really butt together. CB radio, Citizens Band, that's in the 11 meter space, so it's right above the 10 meters. And about between 6 and 10 is the variation between high frequency and very high frequency, but they both can kind of operate as high frequency and very high frequency characteristics tend to do, which is propagation over the horizon communication. Sometimes 10 and 6 meters can, if the atmospheric conditions are right, can propagate over the horizon, bounce around within the atmosphere a few times. You can make some really long distance contacts. Excuse me. That's why I call it 6 meters is one of what fairly new, fairly recently allocated to amateur radios. It's been called a magic band because it can operate have high frequency characteristics as far as propagation goes. Why would you ham radio? It's good for geeks. There's a lot of electronics involved. Whether you're buying new equipment, testing out for somebody else or yourself, just experimenting with new technology, building kits from the ground up. It's soldering and experimenting with new technologies. Whether you're using brand new top-of-the-line equipment or buying junk from eBay or using long since obsolete equipment, such as I mentioned earlier, the original radio teletype equipment. That stuff's still out there. If people can find it, they will buy it, fix it, and use it to print out a little ticker tape of a radio teletype transmission in 2019. And some of the older original amateur radio kits or stations using vacuum tubes as amplifiers, those are still around. I have 2 of them myself I'm trying to revive, but it's a struggle sometimes. There's a little something for everyone. If you're into computers, which if you're at this conference you probably are, I mentioned earlier the digital modes like Whisper, Weak Signal Propagation Reporter. That's all digital, it's all done over computers, it's automated. But it's a PC integration with your radio, but using similar technologies, you'll have keyboard to keyboard contacts. So you type, hit enter, it modulates it into an analog sound, and then the other station picks it up. Almost like a wireless chat room, if anybody remembers those. Are they still around? It's been a while. And so most of this can even be totally controlled with your computer, so you're not fiddling with knobs, switches, anything. It integrates right into your computer. So you set all your parameters from your mouse and keyboard, and then fire and forget. With the proper equipment and antennas and all that, you can pick up transmissions from weather satellites, uncompressed, beautiful pictures of the Earth from weather satellites. You can pick up information from NASA, all the probes that are out within the solar system, and even recently beyond. They are using radio frequency to communicate back to the Earth. With the right equipment, you can pick up and look at that information. I think it's pretty interesting. And if you're more of an alien person, I guess this fits in with the theme of this year. But anything that the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence Network is picking up, you can find too. So anything that you can contribute and submit to their organization, amateur radio operators do participate with the SETI network. If you're a competitor, I mentioned earlier, there's almost always a contest running, whether you're filling in a grid map of the United States using VHF only. Trying to contact California from West Virginia using very high frequency is a very interesting challenge, but with the right atmospheric conditions, it can be done. Or, low power international contacts. I've seen on YouTube a young man contact South Africa from Florida using 5 watts. If you're familiar with electronics, that's not very much juice at all. And that was using voice, which takes up about the most bandwidth of the frequency. These digital modes and Morse code are just tiny little slivers within the wavelength, but using voice on 5 watts to get a couple thousand miles over the ocean, it's impressive. Right place, right time, right atmospheric conditions. Propagation is its own study that's constantly being experimented with. It could be its own class. Almost any of these slides could be their own class. It's just a high-level introductory. So if you wanted more details, then you're in the wrong talk. The ARL magazine QST, I have a couple up here if anybody's interested in browsing through. Put that out monthly. I think it's the best place to list contests, because they got them all listed and the different frequencies, the times, the modes, anything to do with the contest are all in that magazine. And emergencies. We've discovered when the derecho hit, Superstorm Sandy, all the other wonderful things that have hit our state in the last few years, cell towers are unreliable. Even if they plug up a generator to one of the more popular ones, I mean, you're lucky to get, you might have a good signal, but you won't have very good internet connection. You might have trouble getting a telephone call out. But the amateur radio repeaters are always around, and if you contacting somebody else on their own radio, as long as your battery's charged, there's no infrastructure there. So if you have an emergency, there's always somebody listening. As we learned over the past weekend, our internet infrastructure is vulnerable. So, I mean, if the internet goes out for your entire organization or your house, or any of the hardware associated with the internet is taken down for whatever reason, whether nefarious or, act of God, then we've always got our radios. And the plain old telephone service, which was thought to be more reliable than, the cable and the other services, its use is declining. Even though it gets, power directly from the phone company, its use is declining, so it's not as reliable as it once was, and that continues to go down. Where is ham radio? Ham radio is everywhere. Groups of like-minded individuals. There's several hams associated with the group in this conference. I'm looking at 3, 4, just in this room. So, you'll probably find amateur radio operators about anywhere you go. We tend to find each other, especially if you got one of these hooked to your belt. I mean, we'll point it out and talk and trade call signs and frequencies just to have fun. That's what we do. You'd be hard-pressed to find a true survivalist or outdoorsman, doomsday prepper, what have you, without at least a handheld transceiver, something like this, handheld transceiver, HT. There's a lot of acronyms, so if I use an acronym somebody doesn't understand, please stop me. Also, if there's any questions or comments or anything, just shout. I don't mind. Even if you're not transmitting because you're afraid of radio direction finding, you're at least listening, because the three-letter agencies might be after you. You never know. I once transmitted outside of amateur radio band, so I'm waiting for the FCC to kick down the door any day now. They're watching. That's why I put a fake name on the sign outside. That's not true. And almost all veterans use the radio at some point. They know that communication is key. That's actually what got me interested in amateur radio, the high-frequency propagation, over-the-horizon communication, the digital modes. I was a crew chief on Black Hawk helicopters, and we had a basic but very reliable high-frequency system where we could automatically report GPS coordinates over high frequency, over the horizon, without any. It was every so minutes it would broadcast out our position, and our station, back at the flagpole could hear it. The AWACS radios, satellites could pick it up and tell our position all over the world. It was completely automated, completely wireless, and completely encrypted, useless to anybody else listening. But that's what really got me interested in. So a lot of veterans either lugged around a Singars or carried a walkie-talkie or something. So most of us are familiar with radios at all. Conferences, there's almost always a ham talking somewhere. We're hosting testing after this talk somewhere. I'm not sure where, in one of the rooms, I imagine. Oh, well, here. So hang around if you're interested in testing. And there's talks on amateur radio at some of these conferences. I've seen. I went to ham radio for hackers at DerbyCon last year. I don't think they had much for ham radio this year. Not that I saw. I didn't think so. I should have put in my CFP. I didn't think I would. Always put in your CFP. Let them tell you no. Online forums, I've learned, have been a great resource for amateur radio. QRZ.net. I found some parts I've been scouring the internet for my radio, and I just had to go in there, do a search, and found it. Some of the amateur radio operators are getting along in their years, so they may not be familiar with the Facebook or or any of the other services that some of the younger guys might be using, so we have to do a little digging. Facebook groups, local, regional, worldwide, there's a Facebook group for just about anything associated with amateur radio. And Slack channels, anybody use Slack for anything? It's a pretty interesting group there. North America Hams, I found it from DerbyCon. It's run by an amateur radio operator out of Canada, but there's a lot of good information in there. There was an article I read a while ago about how somebody sent Bitcoin from Canada to California over amateur radio. So I posted that in that group, and they was like, yeah, that was us. So they detailed on how it was done. So I thought that was just fascinating, you know, sending encrypted currency from one country to another without infrastructure, you know. What else? What other nefarious things could you do? You know, it gets the mind spinning. That's amateur radio. Local clubs host testing. I know one of the local clubs here where I got my technician license. They test the first Friday of every month, whether there's one person or 20. And conferences host testing. We're hosting the technician test shortly after this talk. I got my general license at DerbyCon. It's something a lot associated with a lot of geeks, so there's almost always a test somewhere. Yes?
One year we had, at HackerCon, we did 11 tests. We had 10 people pass. And yes, one person didn't pass his own board. I won't make fun of any.
Oh, it was good today.
He got it eventually. He did. So if you have any interest to go, I would encourage you to take the test. It's free. You can probably guess your way through half of it, but at least get a feel for it.
And there's not stress.
And no charge.
No charge.
Unlike the every Friday, it's $15, I think.
Yeah, $15.
We don't charge anything.
First responders, monitoring and backup communication. 911 Metro has a amateur radio station in their office. The CAMC Medbase, who does dispatch for all their hospitals, they have an amateur radio station. That's why my dad has his technician license, because after September 11th, they saw that all of their communications went down with the North Tower, I believe. So a lot of the first responder organizations around the country and around the world got into amateur radio for just such an occasion. Has anybody read World War Z? Not the movie with Brad Pitt. Read the book.
They made a book out of that?
That's strike one. The book is fascinating to me. I think it's a very interesting view into a post-apocalyptic situation. Trade zombies out for about any disaster, and it paints a decent picture of how the world would act if everything just kind of crashed. But there was several chapters in there regarding communication. You know, if anybody read the chapter about the astronauts staying at the space station for several years just to keep communication satellites up. There was the radio operator out of, I think it was Pakistan, maybe? But they would broadcast out survival information to pockets of survivors from a ship. And it was all over shortwave using amateur bands because it's easy to get a hold of the hardware. So of all the times I've read that book, you know, good communication is the best way to survive. Along with water purification, you know, good food. It's a long list, but communication's on there. If anybody wants to see a fictional practical example of amateur radio, twice, strike two. World War Z is the place to do it. How do you ham radio? We were talking about testing earlier. There's 3 levels of amateur radio licensing. Technician's the first. Pretty much limits you to the very high frequency band. There are some access to the high frequency. So with your first exam, you could be making worldwide, you know, global contacts. Even easier if you learn Morse code, continuous wave. General is the next level. That's where I'm at now. That's almost the entire amateur radio allocation, with amateur extra being just a tiny little bit more reserved for the higher level exam and license. You can get licensed through self-study. The American Radio Relay League They put out books. I've got one up here if anybody wants to flip through it. Ham Radio for Dummies, that was my first publication. You can see my well-worn book up here. That's what I use to get my technician license. And mobile apps. All the test banks are public, so it's easier for somebody to program an app for the test, so you can mark what you get wrong, study what you need, or just blindly go through it time and time again until you at least know what answers to pick should the question come up. That's basically what a cram session is. They print out all the test questions. You'll sit in a room like this one all day, go through all the questions several times, and at the very end, knock out the exam while all the answers are fresh in your mind and perfectly legal. Silly, but you don't really learn anything, but at least you get to push the transmit button. There are professional courses that will teach you all you need to know about amateur radio. Most of what I've seen are offered online. Even those are self-paced, but if you have trouble studying on your own, it might be a good resource to follow. And the magic of YouTube, it's a combination of everything above. There are people that have put together entire teaching courses on using all the questions. There's YouTube cram sessions. There's all kinds of different resources on YouTube. How to get on the air. Cheap HTs or handheld transmitters. Bofang UV5R, loved and despised throughout the amateur radio world. $25, and with the free license exam, you have to pass it. And you're on the air. You can communicate with, within several miles of here. You can access repeaters. You can get into digital modes through PC integrations. It doesn't take thousands and thousands of dollars to get into amateur radio. This is an amateur radio. I mean, it's the cheapest and probably the most basic, but this was my first amateur radio. I bought it on Amazon with my Ham Radio for Dummies book. It's all real life stuff. Regulations are changing for these things because they can be programmed to operate in different frequency ranges, like the FRS radios and GMRS, MERS, if you're familiar with any of these. They're just different frequency allocations with power limits and removable antennas. FCC doesn't like that, and it's being driven by some very vocal amateur radio operators that don't like that either. So they're pushing to outlaw or change how somebody can advertise and sell something like this that is capable of broadcasting outside of the amateur radio bands. That's a study on its own, just that legal battle. It's not very interesting. I don't recommend it unless you really, really cannot sleep. Then dig into it. Mobile units, those are, I think, the most fun because you can pack up and take off. Capable of more power, bigger antennas, greater reach out either towards the horizon or even over it. Even a handheld transmitter with a better antenna. This is just a basic rubber duck, but they get much better antennas with these. I was going to bring the other one, but it's like this big. I'm game. It's.
Now you're just bragging.
Stop. Even using a mobile unit as a base station, that's what I've got set up at my house. I've got a 2-meter VHF radio set up as my base station. For what I do with it, it's perfect. I don't need to spend several $100s on a big, bulky 1,000-watt VHF transmitter. My $40 Craigslist find does just fine. But if you want to really reach the limits of capabilities, you look into the base stations. With thousands of watts going out with PC integrations, you can really reach the true potential of your amateur radio station with the fancier base stations. Though it's hard to go mobile and do some of the more active parts of amateur radio. High frequency is where where the fun really is. I mean, VHF is useful, but if you really want to talk over the horizon, or you'll get into contests, anything like that, high frequency is where you want to go. There's on the subject of propagation, you get into the medium and low frequencies. The atmosphere kind of absorbs those frequencies, And you get into very high frequency, ultra high frequency, the transmissions go right through the atmosphere. So high frequency is kind of the sweet spot where it can bounce around in the atmosphere, off the Earth, back up the atmosphere, and then you can reach South Africa from Florida on 5 watts using voice. So that's kind of why high frequency is really the place to be. You get what you pay for with high frequency. I mean, you can spend a couple $100 and find something on Wish.com or any of the other cloning sites, or you can spend several $1,000s on a Kenwood or an ICOM setup. But really, it's one of the things you get what you pay for. A complete set, software-defined radio setup where it's got a built-in display of the entire band, so you can scan around and see, oh, look, there's traffic there. That's where I'll tune. Or like I mentioned, the old boat anchor. That's where the tube-fed and amplified radios, because they're huge, they're heavy. You can find those on Craigslist, Facebook, fairly cheap. I've got one. It's a bear to work with, but it's a Heath kit. It was a order by mail kit built in the 70s, so it was designed to be completely assembled by an amateur radio operator, so it's got a good manual, good to work with. Hard to find parts, though. And then you get into the larger antennas, which can be kind of ungainly. You stick it up on a huge tower, you've got guy lines to deal with, the concrete pads to pull it into. It can be difficult. And one of the more interesting things is we'll call it the stealth mode antennas. You get into some of these municipalities, even homeowners associations that don't allow you to have amateur radio antennas strung up from the trees, sticking up out of your yard, etc. So they've come up with stealthy ways to put their antennas up and kind of avoid those regulations. It's fascinating to see what these guys have come up with. Taking a picture, can you even find my antenna? And if we can't find it, we know what to look for, then some grumpy homeowners association person probably can't find it either. Resources. One of my favorites, especially to kind of jump right into, is Ham Radio for Dummies. If anybody's familiar with the For Dummies series, it's a great place to start. It's where I started. I got my technician license from Ham Radio for Dummies. What surprised me was Pinterest has a lot of great links to other articles on amateur radio. I built my RF sampler from a link I found on Pinterest. So if anybody uses Pinterest for crafts or cooking or whatever, you can get that for ham stuff too. Mentioned YouTube earlier, in particular for new operators, amateur radio operator Dave Kassler, KE0OG. He has a great web channel on YouTube, a whole series called Ask Dave, where he answers different questions on one subject. He's got a self-study section. He reviews products, both bottom and top of the line, so whether you've got money to spend or you're on a budget, he's probably covered it. American Radio Relay League exam manuals. I've got the general book up here, if anybody, that's how I got my general license. It's got all the test questions, all the subjects with, comments. This is test question A, sample quizzes at the end. Start to finish, that can get you your license. And QST Magazine, it's a monthly publication from the American Radio Relay League. I've got a couple of those up here too. There's almost always a project to work on, something you can build. I built my dummy load out of an article in QST. There's always a story about a de-expedition. Looks like the one on top there is into Antarctica. Anybody's interested in going to Antarctica just to play with radios? That sounds fun to me, but there's also Micronesia and tropical islands. That's more your thing. But either way, it's a good resource for information. You don't have to be licensed to be a member of the Radio Relay League or to get this magazine. You can probably find them laying around in dentist offices and whatnot. But it's just another good resource. That is the end of my talk. Open for questions, comments, concerns, alibis.
How much information do you know before taking a technician license?
If you're familiar with radio frequency, the question was, how much do you need to know before taking technician license. If you're familiar with radio frequency electronics at all, depending on the questions given to you, you could probably fake your way through it, but if you've not studied at all, you might run into some issues with rules and regulations that the FCC has put out, and especially where you can transmit, because that's kind of bigger on in the technician section, because they don't want to just hand a license to anybody, because if you transmit it outside of your frequency, then that's just the worst thing. Who would do that? I mean, you can probably fake your way through it. It can't hurt. I mean, if you fail the exam, they're not going to even mail it in. So.
Okay.
Band plans. That'll pretty much screw you. It's all luck of the draw, though. There's, what, 10,000 questions?
Several hundred questions, I think.
300.
I'm not sure if it's randomly drawn or if they pick out so many sections out.
I think it's weighted somehow, but I don't know how.
I mean, it can't hurt to try. So if you go to a club to your first exam, that's where I went. I passed my technician's exam, and they're like, "Do you want to take the general now?" I was like, "Well, I haven't studied for that." He's like, "Well, you're here. You can. If you sit and study enough, you can get all 3 licenses in one sitting. Because after you've passed the exam and certified by a volunteer examiner, then you're an amateur radio operator. You got to wait a little while to get your first call sign. But even if you're already a technician and you pass your general, at that time you can operate in the general frequencies as well. So the rules and regulations, the band plan, the safety stuff. If you're not up on that, that might be your weak spot. But if you're familiar with electronics, radio frequency at all, then you might be able to make your way through it.
There's no math in the technical. You don't have to go into electronics. Schematic.
Relationship of power levels to decibels. There's a few of those.
There's also wavelength questions and voltage, resistance.
You're right. There are.
But the bulk of the questions is regulations. It's not allowed to transmit here, shouldn't transmit this close to that. All that kind of stuff.
Does that answer your question? Do any more?
What was that radio model?
Bofeng, I think I'm saying it wrong. Probably not. UV5R. This one is from Amazon. If you just look for, ham radio, handheld, probably one of your top results. There's all kinds of different ones from all kinds of different manufacturers, but this one is the cheapest, so that's why I bought it. But a couple of these for different reasons. I've got the entire family radio service, general mobile radio service, multi-use radio service, weather radio, all kinds of different frequencies programmed in here. And that's probably why the FCC doesn't like them, because you're not supposed to transmit on those frequencies with one of these. The little blister pack radios you see at Walmart and whatnot, those are ultra high frequency transceivers at a certain bandwidth. And those are licensed to do that and just that. Technically, I can transmit on that with this. I'm not supposed to. It's violation of FCC rules. I'm subject to a fine and imprisonment eventually, but that's why I don't like these. So if they're still out, grab one. Yes?
Can you do CB on those?
CB, no, not on these. CB falls into the high frequency. We talked about the bands earlier. CB is on 11 meters. If it was to be, it's typically not called, the 11-meter band. It's just called CB. But no, this one won't do that. Yes.
I came in late, but so when you say bands, because you're talking about the wavelength, not the frequency.
Correct. That's that's the section of the radio frequency spectrum that's been allocated to. Let me go back.
There's a band plan that's agreed upon. The FCC gives you a certain set of frequencies, and then basically we just agreed on what we use within those frequencies. And then each level of license gets a certain section of that band. And there's a calculation.
Here's the band
I
plan.
don't remember it, that you can convert between the frequency and the meters. Okay. that tells you 144 is such and such meter.
If you look at the wavelength is the distance between these dotted lines. That's when the radio frequency, the alternating current, changes from positive voltage to a negative voltage in the air. So as the frequency increases, the waves themselves get longer and wider. So as those waves get longer and wider, the distance between the two gets greater. So when you get into the band plan here, you'll see that the 2-meter band is within the 144 megahertz. So it's 144 to 148 megahertz. So instead of saying that, they just say the wavelength of this frequency group is about 2 meters. So that's just what it is. So but you get into the some of the ultra high frequencies, the wavelength is 70 centimeters. Even the highest one, there's 160 meters in between the distance of the wavelength. And there's one that's coming. It should be available this year, I think, at 2,000 some meters. So I mean, this is the band plan. You mentioned earlier that this section here is mostly what you'll get with your first license, the technician. If you see this little section here, this is authorized for technicians, but on CW only, continuous wave Morse code. And then the same over here. And if you want to work in 10 meters, your technicians are authorized on single sideband phone or voice in 10 meters. So you can get into high frequency work and global long distance communications with just your technician license. But you are limited as to what you can actually do on those licenses.
Thank you.
Questions?
The test, there's 300 questions, or the pool is 300?
The pool is 300. There's over 35 questions, if I remember right. Then for the technician and the general, the amateur extra, the pool is 500, I believe, with 50 questions. So it's a little tougher. There is math involved in that one. I don't know of any organizations that do cram sessions for the amateur extra.
Paper, or do you take this on a computer?
It's on paper. 2019. Not even a Scantron either. All right, thanks for coming out on a Sunday of a tech conference. I'm glad to see so many smiling faces.